The brakes failed completely at 40 miles an hour, and I watched from our kitchen window as my husband's truck drifted through our own mailbox and came to rest against the oak tree at the edge of our property, steam rising from a crumpled hood that had been perfectly fine 20 minutes earlier when he'd left for the hardware store. My coffee mug shattered against the tile floor the moment I registered what I was actually seeing, and I was out the front door and running across the yard before I fully understood my own legs had started moving, my mind cycling through every possible worst-case scenario in the handful of seconds it took to reach him.
Daniel climbed out, shaking but unhurt, and the mechanic who towed the truck later that afternoon found something that made his expression shift from routine annoyance into genuine unease.
"Ma'am, I need to show you something." He pointed underneath the vehicle at a brake line that had been cut cleanly, not torn through wear, not corroded through age, but sliced with something precise enough that he initially assumed it must have happened during the tow itself. "This wasn't an accident," he said quietly.
"Somebody did this on purpose." I stood in our driveway, staring at that severed line, and something cold and unfamiliar settled into my chest, a fear that had nothing to do with combat zones or deployments, and everything to do with the sudden, sickening realization that someone, somewhere, wanted my husband dead badly enough to reach directly into our driveway to make it happen.
But let me back up a little, because none of what happened over the following months makes sense without understanding exactly what Daniel and I had already survived together before a cut brake line ever entered the picture. I'm Colonel Sarah Holloway, currently assigned to Fort Bliss, Texas, 19 years in uniform, married for 16 years to Command Sergeant Major Daniel Holloway, an infantry senior enlisted leader whose steady, unshakable presence had carried our family through 2 deployments, a difficult pregnancy, and, 4 years earlier, a diagnosis of non-Hodgkin lymphoma that had, for nearly a year, made every single ordinary Tuesday feel like it might be one of our last together. I still remembered the exact way the oncologist's voice had sounded delivering that diagnosis, clinical and careful, and the way Daniel had reached for my hand under the small paper-covered table before either of us said a single word to each other.
He had fought through 8 brutal rounds of chemotherapy with the same quiet determination he brought to every training exercise, losing 40 pounds and all of his hair, continuing to mentor young soldiers by phone from a hospital bed whenever his energy allowed it, insisting the entire time that this was simply another mission requiring discipline rather than despair.
I had watched him vomit into a bucket at 2 in the morning, and then, 6 hours later, put on a brave face for our daughter's school pickup. And I had learned, during those months, exactly how much strength a person could quietly carry without ever once complaining about the weight of it. Daniel had been in complete remission for 2 full years by the time that brake line failed, cancer-free, cleared for full duty, slowly rebuilding the physical strength the treatment had stripped from him 1 careful month at a time. During his diagnosis, our financial advisor had recommended we look into supplemental life insurance coverage, given the uncertainty of his prognosis at the time, and we had worked with an agent named Roger Denton, a smooth, reassuring man who had handled the additional policy paperwork personally, walking us through documents during some of the most frightening weeks of our marriage, weeks when neither Daniel nor I had the emotional capacity to scrutinize fine print as carefully as we probably should have. I called Special Agent Monica Ashford, an FBI contact a fellow officer had once used during an unrelated fraud investigation, the same evening the mechanic showed me that severed brake line, uncertain whether local police or federal authorities were even the right people to call, but desperate enough for answers that I called everyone I could think of simultaneously. Before her callback came through, I called my closest friend on post, Colonel Lauren Ibarra, unable to sit alone with the fear settling into our house. She arrived within 20 minutes, and I told her everything: the truck, the severed line, the mechanic's careful, unsettling certainty that this hadn't been an accident. "Sarah, has anything else felt off lately? Anything at all?" I started to say no, then stopped myself, remembering something I'd dismissed weeks earlier as simple carelessness. Daniel's blood pressure medication got refilled early last month. He said the pharmacy must have made a mistake, gave him an extra 30 days he hadn't asked for yet. Lauren's expression sharpened. "That's worth mentioning to whoever you end up talking to." I hadn't thought of it as anything beyond a minor annoyance until that exact moment, and the possibility that it might be connected to something larger settled into my stomach like a stone. Agent Ashford listened carefully to everything once she called back: the cut brake line, Daniel's cancer history, the supplemental policy Roger Denton had arranged 4 years earlier, and the strange early prescription refill Lauren had helped me remember. "Colonel Holloway, I need to ask you something specific. Do you know the current status of that supplemental policy? Has it remained with the original insurance carrier, or has anything changed regarding ownership or beneficiary structure since it was originally issued?" I admitted I had no idea, that Daniel and I had simply assumed the policy continued exactly as originally written once his remission was confirmed. "I'd like to pull the full history on that policy before we go any further," Agent Ashford said. "Because a severed brake line targeting someone with an active life insurance policy isn't a coincidence I'm comfortable dismissing, and I want to understand exactly who currently has a financial stake in your husband's mortality before we assume this is simply random vandalism." Agent Ashford's inquiry, filed formally with state insurance regulators the following week, uncovered something within days that made the cut brake line feel considerably less random and considerably more calculated. Daniel's supplemental policy, originally issued through Roger Denton's agency during his diagnosis, had been quietly sold on what regulators called the viatical settlement secondary market. Less than 6 months after the original policy was issued, transferred to an investment group called Vantage Life Partners for a lump sum payment that neither Daniel nor I had ever received, authorized through a signature on transfer documents that Daniel insisted, the moment Agent Ashford showed him a copy, was not his own. Agent Ashford explained the industry itself carefully during that same meeting, walking us through concepts neither of us had ever needed to understand before that afternoon. Viatical settlements emerged decades ago as a legitimate financial tool, originally designed to help terminally ill patients, often facing devastating medical costs, access cash from a policy they might not live long enough to see paid out normally. In principle, it can be a genuinely compassionate financial option for someone facing certain imminent death. She paused. The problem is the same mechanism creates a market where sophisticated investors profit specifically from mortality timing, and where the incentive structure, however legal on its surface, can quietly reward exactly the outcome families are praying against. "I never signed this," Daniel said, studying the forged signature with a mixture of confusion and growing anger. "I don't even remember a conversation about selling the policy." We were barely functioning that month, between the chemo schedule and everything else. Agent Ashford's expression remained carefully neutral, though I could see the same cold understanding settling into her that had already settled into me. "Colonel Holloway, viatical settlements are a legal financial instrument when conducted properly and with the policyholder's genuine informed consent. Investors purchase policies from terminally ill or high-risk individuals at a discount, then collect the full death benefit once the insured passes away, essentially betting that the payout will exceed what they paid to acquire the policy plus ongoing premiums." She paused. "The problem here based on what I'm seeing, is that your husband never actually agreed to any of this. Grace Bellamy, an attorney I retained the same week, Agent Ashford's initial findings arrived, specialized in insurance fraud cases, and had, she told me during our first meeting, encountered viatical fraud schemes before, though rarely one involving what appeared to be an outright forged signature rather than simple predatory pressure on a genuinely consenting policyholder. The night before that first meeting with Grace, I found Daniel sitting alone in our darkened living room long after midnight, staring at nothing in particular. "Can't sleep?" I asked, sitting down beside him. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear that mailbox," he admitted. "I fought so hard to get past the cancer, Sarah. I never imagined I'd have to fight this hard just to stay alive after I already won that fight." I reached for his hand in the darkness, the same gesture that had carried us through 8 rounds of chemotherapy. "Then we fight this one too. Together, the way we fought the first one," he nodded slowly. Though I could feel the exhaustion in the gesture, a man who had already spent everything he had once defeating one threat only to discover an entirely different kind waiting on the other side of survival. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need you to understand something. I'm not scared of dying. I made my peace with that possibility a long time ago during treatment. I'm scared of dying because someone decided my staying alive was inconvenient to their spreadsheet." I sat with him in that darkness for a long time, understanding I had no answer capable of fully easing a fear that specific, that strange, that entirely unlike anything either of us had trained for across our combined 35 years of military service.
"I need you to understand the financial mechanics of what we're looking at," Grace told me the next day, "because it explains everything about that break line far better than random malice would." She pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop, walking me through the math with the same patient precision Colonel Marsh had once used to walk me through evidence in an entirely different case years earlier.
Vantage Life Partners purchased Daniel's policy for a fraction of its eventual payout value, betting, based on his diagnosis at the time, that he had a limited life expectancy. That bet made financial sense during active treatment, when statistical mortality projections for his specific cancer stage were genuinely poor. Grace's expression tightened. But Daniel went into remission. He's healthy now, likely to live for decades. Every year that passes, Vantage Life Partners pays ongoing premiums on a policy that isn't paying out, watching their expected return shrink further and further from the aggressive projections they originally built their investment around. I felt something ice-cold settle permanently into my chest. "You're saying they need him to die to make their investment worthwhile?" "I'm saying," Grace said carefully, "that an investment fund losing money on a bet like this has a financial incentive that doesn't exist in almost any other kind of fraud case I've handled. And I think we need to take that incentive extremely seriously." Agent Ashford's investigation expanded rapidly once the financial incentive became clear. Pulling records connecting Roger Denton directly to Vantage Life Partners through a referral fee structure that had, over several years, generated him substantial income for policies he'd quietly funneled toward the secondary market. Often, investigators would eventually determine, without full or accurate consent from the policyholders themselves. Denton had specifically targeted clients diagnosed with serious but potentially survivable illnesses, individuals whose initial poor prognosis made their policies attractive to viatical investors, while their eventual chance of remission made the underlying bet considerably riskier than Vantage Life Partners' own marketing materials to potential investors ever fully disclosed. I learned the full scope of Denton's operation from Melissa Ortiz, a former administrative assistant at his agency, who contacted Grace's office directly after learning, through a mutual contact, that a formal investigation had begun. We met at a coffee shop near Fort Bliss, Melissa visibly nervous throughout our entire conversation. I processed some of those transfer documents myself, she admitted. Roger told me the policyholders had all verbally consented over the phone, that the physical signatures were just formalities he was expediting on their behalf, given how overwhelmed families going through cancer treatment usually were. Her hands trembled around her coffee cup. I believed him for a long time. I stopped believing him the week I saw him practice signatures on a legal pad before a client meeting. Grace arranged a formal deposition with Roger Denton 5 weeks after Melissa's revelations, part of the civil discovery process running parallel to Agent Ashford's expanding criminal investigation.
I insisted on attending despite Grace's mild reservation, needing to look directly at the man who had sat across from Daniel and me during the most frightening weeks of our marriage, while apparently already calculating how to profit from exactly the outcome we were praying against.
Denton arrived looking considerably less polished than the smooth, reassuring agent I remembered from those hospital-adjacent meetings years earlier. His attorney beside him working visibly to contain a client whose composure had clearly been fraying for weeks under mounting evidence. Grace began methodically, walking through the forged signature, the referral payment structure connecting him to Vantage Life Partners, and Melissa's testimony regarding the practiced forgeries. Mr. Denton, did you obtain Daniel Holloway's genuine consent before transferring his policy to the viatical secondary market? Denton's hands remained still, but his voice carried a defensiveness that did little to soften the admission underneath it. I believed the family understood the general concept of supplemental coverage adjustments. I may have expedited some paperwork on their behalf given how overwhelmed they clearly were that month. Expedited, Grace repeated flatly. Is that the word you used with yourself while forging his signature and collecting a referral fee for selling a cancer patient's policy to investors betting on his death? Denton didn't answer for a long moment. I told myself the families never really needed the death benefit intact, if they were desperate enough for immediate cash during treatment, he finally said quietly. I convinced myself I was providing a service, not committing a crime. I sat perfectly still through the rest of the deposition, understanding that this wasn't cartoonish villainy. It was simply a man who had let easy money talk him into believing a lie convenient enough to live with, and somehow that realization unsettled me even more than outright malice would have. With Melissa's cooperation, the forged signature confirmed through forensic document analysis, and the financial trail connecting Denton directly to Vantage Life Partners' referral payments, Agent Ashford's investigation formally expanded into potential conspiracy charges, examining whether anyone connected to Vantage Life Partners had gone beyond simply purchasing a fraudulently transferred policy into actively attempting to accelerate their investment's return. The brake line, tested by a specialized forensic mechanic working alongside the FBI's investigation, showed cut marks consistent with a bolt cutter applied with deliberate precision to a specific brake line rather than general vehicle sabotage. An attack, investigators determined, that had been calculated to appear like sudden mechanical failure rather than obvious tampering, precisely the kind of death that would raise no immediate red flags for an insurance claim. Agent Ashford eventually traced the brake line tampering to a private investigator named Curtis Fallon, hired by Vantage Life Partners fund manager under the pretense of conducting routine policy verification wellness checks, a euphemism investigators determined the fund had used repeatedly to justify surveillance on policyholders whose remission was cutting into expected investment returns. Fallon had been photographing our house for nearly 3 weeks before that brake line failed, Agent Ashford told us, showing us surveillance photographs recovered from his own equipment during the eventual search warrant images of our driveway, our garage, Daniel's truck parked in exactly the spot it always sat overnight, documented with the same clinical thoroughness Fallon apparently brought to every assignment, regardless of its actual purpose. Seeing those photographs, understanding that a stranger had been quietly documenting our ordinary life for weeks while we remained completely unaware, left me with a specific lingering violation that took considerably longer to process than the brake line itself had. Fallon, once identified and confronted, cooperated fully with investigators in exchange for reduced charges, revealing that he had been paid a substantial bonus contingent specifically on Daniel's policy, paying out within a defined time frame, an arrangement that made his financial interest in accelerating Daniel's death explicit rather than incidental. I told myself I was just supposed to gather information, Fallon told investigators, according to Agent Ashford's report. The brake line was supposed to look like an accident that might slow him down, maybe put him in the hospital, create complications given his medical history. I never intended it to actually kill him. I sat with that statement for a long time after Agent Ashford shared it with me, understanding that the distinction Fallon was drawing meant almost nothing, given how easily that severed brake line could have ended considerably differently on a busy highway instead of our own quiet driveway. The federal trial, combining fraud charges against Roger Denton and Vantage Life Partners fund manager, Gregory Hale, alongside attempted murder charges against Curtis Fallon, convened 7 months later at the federal courthouse in El Paso. Melissa Ortiz testified first, describing Denton's practiced forgeries and the systematic pattern of consent violations across dozens of similarly vulnerable clients. Special Agent Ashford testified next, walking the court through the financial trail connecting Denton's referral payments to Vantage Life Partners and the specific bonus structure that had incentivized Fallon's surveillance operation. Daniel testified as well, his voice steady despite the visible difficulty of describing exactly what it felt like to learn that strangers had been financially betting on his death for years without his knowledge, watching his own recovery from cancer as a disappointing outcome rather than a triumph. I fought through 8 rounds of chemotherapy to get my life back, Daniel told the court. I never imagined that surviving would make me a financial liability to people I'd never even met. Curtis Fallon testified under his cooperation agreement, describing the specific bonus structure and Gregory Hale's direct instructions regarding expediting the timeline on several underperforming policies in Vantage Life Partners' portfolio.
Testimony that expanded the case significantly once investigators realized Daniel's policy wasn't the only one Fallon had been assigned to monitor under similarly troubling arrangements.
One of the other identified victims, a retired master sergeant named Robert Chen, who had survived a similar cancer diagnosis 11 years earlier, also testified that week, describing 2 unexplained house fires investigators were now re-examining given the newly discovered pattern. I always thought I was just unlucky, Chen told the court, his voice tight with a controlled anger I recognized completely. 2 electrical fires in 3 years, both starting in places that made no sense to the fire marshal at the time. I never once considered someone might have wanted them to happen. His testimony landed heavily across the courtroom, several jurors visibly shaken by the implication that Daniel's brake line wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader, calculated pattern of financial predation dressed up as unfortunate coincidence. The prosecutor, during closing arguments, held up the forged transfer document beside Vantage Life Partners' internal bonus structure spreadsheet and said only, "This defendant treated a man's survival of cancer as a business problem requiring a solution, and that solution nearly cost Command Sergeant Major Holloway his life in his own driveway." The jury convicted Gregory Hale and Curtis Fallon on all counts, Hale receiving 8 years for conspiracy, and attempted murder given his role directing the surveillance operation. Fallon receiving 12 years under his cooperation agreement. Roger Denton was convicted separately on multiple counts of insurance fraud and forgery, receiving 9 years and permanent revocation of his insurance licensing. Judge Patricia Renner, delivering her sentencing remarks, addressed the courtroom directly before adjourning. This court has heard testimony describing a financial ecosystem where a man's recovery from cancer became, to certain investors, a disappointing outcome rather than a triumph worth celebrating. That inversion of basic human decency, dressed up in legitimate-sounding financial terminology, deserves exactly the accountability this court is prepared to deliver today. The court additionally voided the fraudulent policy transfer entirely, restoring full ownership to Daniel and awarding substantial damages against Vantage Life Partners' remaining assets. Funds Grace helped ensure were distributed appropriately among Denton's other identified victims rather than solely benefiting our own family. Outside the courthouse, Daniel and I stood together on the steps, both of us still absorbing a verdict that offered accountability without ever fully erasing the specific, lingering fear of watching him climb behind the wheel of any vehicle for months afterward. Robert Chen found us there, extending his hand to Daniel first, then to me. "I wanted to thank you both," he said. "I don't think my case ever gets reopened without your brake line, making investigators take a second look at cases like mine." Daniel shook his hand firmly. "I'm sorry it took something like this to connect the pattern." "Don't be sorry. Be glad you survived long enough to be the reason it finally got connected at all." We stood together for a few minutes longer, 3 people bound by an investment fund's cold calculations, before Chen finally excused himself, promising to stay in touch. "I keep thinking about how close that could have gone differently," Daniel said quietly, "if you hadn't been standing at that window at exactly the right moment." "I think about that too," I admitted. "But I also think about how much worse it could have been if we'd never questioned it at all, if we'd simply assumed it was random bad luck the way anyone reasonably might have." Daniel reached for my hand, the same steady grip that had carried both of us through cancer treatment and 2 deployments before this ordeal ever began. "I don't know how to process being worth more to strangers dead than alive," he admitted. "That's not something I ever prepared myself to survive." "You don't have to process it alone," I told him. "You just have to keep choosing to be here. However uncomfortable, that fact makes some very specific people." 1 year after that afternoon, watching Daniel's truck drift through our mailbox, life had settled into a version of normal that still occasionally caught both of us off guard with unexpected waves of lingering unease. Daniel underwent a full, independent mechanical inspection of every vehicle we owned monthly for nearly a year, a habit our mechanic gently assured us was no longer strictly necessary, but that neither of us felt quite ready to abandon completely. Our daughter, 12 now, had taken to double-checking the locks on every door before bed, without either of us ever asking her to, a quiet, unspoken habit that told me exactly how much of that year's fear had settled into all 3 of us, rather than just Daniel and me.
We eventually found a family therapist who specialized in trauma following targeted violence and the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding a sense of safety in our own home became its own kind of second recovery, running parallel to Daniel's original battle with cancer, but requiring an entirely different set of tools to survive.
Melissa Ortiz left the insurance industry entirely, eventually finding work with a state consumer protection agency, specifically focused on identifying predatory practices, targeting seriously ill patients and their families. Work, she told me, once felt like the only meaningful way she knew how to answer for the months she'd spent unknowingly enabling Denton's scheme. Robert Chen and I stayed in touch after the trial, two strangers connected by an investment fund's cold financial calculations, comparing notes occasionally on the specific, disorienting experience of learning that survival itself had once made us targets rather than success stories. "I keep waiting for it to stop feeling surreal," he told me once. "Knowing people were rooting against your recovery on a spreadsheet somewhere." I told him I understood completely, and I meant it. Agent Ashford's investigation, expanded through Fallon's cooperation, ultimately identified 6 other families connected to similarly fraudulent viatical transfers through Denton's agency, several of whom had experienced their own unexplained accidents that investigators were now re-examining with considerably more scrutiny than they had originally received.
Daniel's health has remained excellent, his most recent oncology follow-up confirming continued full remission, with no evidence of recurrence. A milestone we celebrated quietly at home rather than with any large gathering, both of us having learned, over the preceding year, to hold good news a little more carefully than we once might have.
Our daughter has slowly started sleeping through the night without checking the locks first, a small, ordinary victory that meant more to both of us than almost anything else that entire year produced. Some evenings, watching her fall asleep peacefully in front of the television, the way 12-year-olds are supposed to be able to do without a second thought, I find myself grateful in a way that feels almost too large for ordinary words. Understanding exactly how easily that ordinary peace could have been permanently stolen from all 3 of us. If our story has taught me anything worth sharing, it's this. Surviving illness should never become a reason to fear the people financially connected to your own mortality. And yet somewhere in the machinery of modern finance, a market exists that quietly, legally, sometimes illegally, treats a person's continued survival as a disappointing return on investment. Daniel fought through cancer with a discipline and courage I will never stop being proud of, and he deserved, at minimum, to celebrate that survival without also having to fight off strangers whose spreadsheets had quietly bet against him the entire time. I used to believe the greatest threats to the people we love wore obvious faces, jealousy, anger, greed expressed through recognizable human cruelty. I understand now that some of the most dangerous threats wear considerably more paperwork than that, dressed up in financial jargon and referral fee structures, quietly profitable right up until someone finally asks the uncomfortable question of exactly who benefits from a specific piece of bad luck. If this story moved you, or reminded you that some threats to the people we love wear considerably more paperwork than any villain we might expect, I'd be honored if you shared it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell me what part of this story stayed with you the longest. And if you'd like to hear more stories about resilience, survival, and refusing to let fear win even after the worst has already happened, I'd love for you to subscribe and join me again next time. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourselves and never stop asking who actually benefits when something about your own safety doesn't add up. The end.